Imagine being trapped in a failing body, told by the world's most brilliant minds that your paralysis, your degenerative disease, your impending death is finally curable. In the early 2000s, millions of desperate patients were handed exactly this lifeline, wrapped in the pristine white coat of a celebrated scientist promising the impossible. They wept with relief, believing that bespoke, cloned human embryos would soon yield the stem cells needed to repair their severed spinal cords and dying organs. But this miraculous salvation was a mirage, constructed from fabricated data and stolen hope. The revelation of this elaborate fraud did not just shatter scientific paradigms. It broke the spirits of the vulnerable who had tethered their very will to live to his promises. Families who had mortgaged their futures, waiting for clinical trials that would never materialize, were suddenly plunged into a darkness far deeper than their initial diagnoses. The betrayal was absolute, a violation not of the body, but of the soul's most fragile commodity. They were left to mourn not only their failing health, but the cruel theft of their fleeting optimism. At the center of this devastating illusion stood Hwang Woo-suk, a charismatic veterinarian turned national icon in South Korea. He was not merely a researcher, he was a state-sponsored messiah, flanked by bodyguards and granted millions in government funding. Historical records confirm that his face graced postage stamps and his name became synonymous with a fiercely proud nation's leap into the future. He had seemingly conquered the holy grail of biology, claiming to have successfully created cloned human embryos and extracted their stem cells, a feat the global scientific community thought was decades away. But the foundation of Hwang's empire was rotting from the inside out, built on a staggering, audacious lie. Inside his state-of-the-art laboratory at Seoul National University, the revolutionary breakthroughs being celebrated worldwide were nothing more than a meticulously orchestrated performance. Photographs of identical cells were duplicated and cropped to look like different, thriving colonies. The data charts, published in the world's most prestigious journals, were entirely fictitious, a masterclass in scientific forgery designed to deceive peers and the public alike. Beneath the fabricated data lay an even darker ethical transgression, a profound bioethical nightmare. To fuel his relentless pursuit of the impossible, Hwang required thousands of human eggs, a resource he obtained through coercion and manipulation. Junior female researchers in his own lab were pressured into undergoing invasive, painful procedures to donate their OVA, a gross violation of medical ethics and workplace power dynamics. They were trapped in a web of narcissistic abuse, a psychological manipulation where the abuser uses their authority to exploit subordinates, convincing them that their suffering is for a greater noble cause. The facade, however, could not withstand the quiet, agonizing conscience of those forced to build it. A young researcher, tormented by the ethical breaches and the fabricated results, finally broke ranks. This whistleblower reached out to a South Korean investigative journalism program, sparking a clandestine inquiry into the nation's untouchable hero. The journalists began pulling at the loose threads of his 2004 and 2005 publications, discovering terrifying inconsistencies that hinted at a deception of unimaginable scale. Unmasking this fraud was not a simple matter of presenting the facts. It was a declaration of war against a deeply entrenched national mythology. When the journalists first aired their suspicions regarding the coerced egg donations, the backlash was swift and brutal. Hwang orchestrated a masterful campaign of public manipulation, playing the victim of a jealous media, while thousands of his supporters protested outside the television station, threatening the journalists with violence. Advertisers pulled their funding, and the network was forced into a humiliating public apology, seemingly crushing the truth before it could fully emerge. This period of aggressive denial served to deepen the eventual trauma, manipulating an entire nation into fiercely defending a phantom. Gaslighting, a tactic where a perpetrator causes victims to question their own reality and sanity, was deployed here on a macro level. Hwang wept on national television, promising to retreat to a monastery, a calculated performance that only intensified the public's fervent loyalty and their rage against his detractors. The vulnerable patients, still clinging to his promises, became his most tragic shields, wheeled out in wheelchairs to defend the very man who was actively deceiving them. Yet the pursuit of truth is often relentless, driven by those who refuse to let the darkness win. Anonymous scientists, operating on internet message boards under the safety of pseudonyms, began to forensically dismantle the published images. They pointed out undeniable digital manipulations, overlapping noise patterns, and identical artifacts in photos that were supposed to represent unique, cloned stem cell lines. The whispers of the whistleblowers had become a deafening roar of empirical evidence that the scientific establishment could no longer ignore or sweep under the rug. Cornered by the undeniable proof of his own fabricated images, the walls of his fortress finally collapsed. Seoul National University launched an internal investigation, a reluctant but necessary autopsy of their star researchers' work. The findings were cataclysmic. The university panel concluded that all 11 of the stem cell lines Hwang claimed to have created in his landmark 2005 paper were entirely fake. There were no bespoke cures, no revolutionary breakthroughs, only a void where scientific integrity should have been. The global impact of this revelation was a seismic shockwave that fractured the scientific community. Prestigious journals were forced into humiliating retractions, their rigorous peer review processes exposed as vulnerable to audacious deceit. The scandal triggered a massive crisis of confidence, forcing institutions worldwide to fundamentally restructure their oversight, implementing draconian data verification protocols to prevent another catastrophe. The entire field of bioethics was ripped open, forced to confront how the blind pursuit of prestige had blinded them to the exploitation of human subjects. But the most profound devastation occurred far away from the sterile laboratories and academic tribunals. For the paralyzed individuals, the parents of children with incurable diseases, the unmasking of Hwang Woo-suk was an emotional execution. They had to grieve not only the loss of the cure they believed was imminent, but also the cruel realization that their suffering had been weaponized for one man's ego. The despair that flooded back into their lives was heavier, darker, and more suffocating than before they had ever heard his name. Trust, once shattered on such a colossal scale, leaves a jagged landscape that takes generations to navigate. The betrayal extended beyond the immediate victims. It poisoned the well of public faith in scientific endeavor itself. If the most celebrated minds, backed by the most rigorous institutions, could perpetrate such an elaborate fraud, how could the public ever believe the next promise of a medical miracle? The shadow of this deception still lingers over modern research, a ghost that haunts every new announcement of a breakthrough. The reckoning for the disgraced scientist was a slow, agonizing descent from the pinnacle of national adoration to the cold reality of a courtroom. Hwang was indicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and bioethical violations, facing the very legal system that had once protected his ascent. Court documents indicate he misappropriated millions in research funds, funneling money into private accounts and using it to buy silence. Though he avoided a lengthy prison sentence, his scientific legacy was permanently incinerated, his name becoming a global shorthand for academic disgrace. Yet the narrative of betrayal rarely ends with a simple gavel strike. In a twist that defies the conventional arc of justice, he did not vanish into obscurity. He relocated, pivoting his expertise to animal cloning, building a lucrative business replicating prized dogs and livestock for wealthy clients. This strange resurrection poses a deeply unsettling question about the nature of consequence. Can a man who perpetrated one of the greatest scientific frauds in history simply buy a second act, trading human hope for commercial pet cloning? This enduring reality forces us to confront the uncomfortable limits of accountability. The scientific community purged his data, but society allowed him to find a new, profitable niche. It reveals a disturbing tolerance for deception, provided the perpetrator possesses a marketable skill. The victims of his original fraud are left to watch their betrayer thrive in a different arena, a daily reminder that the scales of justice are often imbalanced, heavily weighted by wealth and technical utility. The saga of the faked stem cell breakthroughs remains a harrowing monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of human trust. It teaches us that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we desperately want to be true. When a society elevates a single individual to the status of a savior, bypassing skepticism in favor of national pride or desperate hope, it creates the perfect incubator for profound betrayal. Ultimately, the unmasking of this elaborate fraud serves as a brutal, necessary inoculation for the modern world. It demands that we look past the pristine white coats and the celebrated headlines, insisting on rigorous, unyielding truth. Because when the intoxicating promise of a miracle is allowed to eclipse the quiet, painstaking reality of science, the resulting collapse destroys far more than just careers. It destroys the very belief that humanity can heal itself.